Hello and welcome to you all for joining us today on AP4D's webinar, Unlocking Australia's Potential as a Renewables Superpower. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gadigal people in Sydney. I acknowledge elders past and present and warmly welcome any Indigenous people who are joining us today. We're delighted that we have such a huge group who are joining us. So I think more than 170 people have registered for this important topic. Some of you are watching live, some of you will be watching later. If you are watching live, please note that the session's being closed captioned, so click on that if that's useful to you. And we will have the ability to share your thoughts in chat and to do some question and answer with our panelists later. So what we're launching today is two papers in AP4D Studies in Statecraft series. So AP4D, Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, was established with a simple but powerful idea that in a difficult and contested world, we need all the tools of statecraft working together to maximise Australia's influence in the world. As well as our own papers, last year we started offering a platform to publish papers which showcase some of those ideas around statecraft. And if you yourself, because I know many wonderful people are on the call, have a paper that might suit this series, please get in touch. What we're delighted to be launching today are two papers, one on Towards a Comprehensive Green Security by James Bowen, and one on the Case for an Australian Clean Commodities Trading Initiative by Elizabeth Thurbon and Oliver Yates. And you will get to hear from them shortly. But before we do that, I suppose we wanted to set the scene a little bit by giving a sense of some of the issues that Australia has to manage in its statecraft. So we're going to welcome first a panel who can give us perspectives from Japan, from PNG, and from the Australian, Canberra policy bubble on the context that we're looking at when we're talking about Australia's future as a potential renewables superpower. So to get us started, I'm going to call upon our first speaker, which is Yuki Tanabe, who is the coordinator of the Sustainable Development and Aid Program at the Japan Centre for Sustainable Environment and Society. So I can see, Yuki, you're getting your slides up. I appreciate that greatly. Now, Yuki, when we're talking about Australia-Japan relations, and particularly the question of liquid natural gas, I'd be interested to hear from you. I know you've written a lot on the role of energy, of renewables in Japan's energy mix and how Australian gas exports fit into that picture. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, possibly as a bit of a mythbuster on this topic. Over to you, Yuki.
Thank you for inviting the webinar. I'm Yuki Tanabe. I work for Japan Center for Sustainable Environment and Society, based in Tokyo. So I'm going to speak about the 3 reasons why Japan doesn't need more Australian gas. This is a picture targeting JERA. JERA is one of the largest Japanese power utility, importing a lot of energy from Australia, and they are investing a lot of energy projects in Australia, like Barossa and Scarborough gas projects. First reason, as you may know, the new gas projects are not 1.5 goal aligned, even if under construction, approval, and the proposed energy project are all in line with the 1.5-degree goal according to the IEA. So let me explain briefly about the history of the Japan-Australia energy deals. Japan has been the top energy importer from Australia. And then China increased a little bit recently, but still the 2 largest countries are importing a lot of energy in Australia. So for Japan, Australia has been the largest energy exporter, and around 30% to 40% energy coming from Australia. And the Japanese companies investing a lot of energy project in Australia. For example, Impex investing in the Ichthys and the Prelude in Northern Territory and Western Australia. And JERA is investing in Barossa and the Scarborough project. These projects are mainly Northern Territory and Western Australia. So Japan recently decided the strategic energy plan towards the 2040. However, they are expecting still 30 to 40% coming from thermal, and renewable energy is only 40 to 50%, unfortunately, even if the 2040. Of course, this is not in line with the IEA 1.5 scenario. The second reason, Japan's new gas deals are not for Japanese energy security. This is the amount of the energy deals handled by Japanese company. And among them, we only use 63% of energy for domestic energy purpose, and the 37% reselling to other countries. So, and also the domestic consumption is declining due to the depopulation. And this reselling amount is higher than the amount from energy from Australia. So that is the increasing now. So the Japanese government committed to keep the energy volume 100 million tons for in the future. So that's why the Japanese energy reselling will be 50% according to the current trend. So the energy reselling size will be the 50% in 2028. And the reselling countries for Taiwan and South Korea, China, Thailand, importing from Japanese companies deals. So why Japan is expanding the energy reselling? Because of the Japanese companies ecosystem. This is an example of the Japanese companies' shares through the energy supply chain. And for the energy plant engineering, 70% share, global share owned by 3 Japanese companies. For energy ship owners, 3 companies owned by 30%. And the gas turbine sector, so Mitsubishi Heavy Industry is a top supplier, owned 36% globally. So that's the reason why Japanese company wants to expand the energy reselling. This is not the purpose of the Japanese energy security. The third reason is fossil Japanese companies and the government are planning to increase the fossil-based abatement technology like hydrogen ammonia co-firing, CCUS. But these technologies are not economically feasible. And in Australia, 43 projects are under planning by Japanese companies. But for example, ammonia 20% co-firing coal plant is 4 times expensive than renewables. So that's why some of the project has been cancelled yet. So we can only relying on the renewable solution is the reliable and feasible solution for both countries, Japan and Australia. I believe the 2 countries can strengthen their partnership and securities through this renewable solution. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yuki. And I think that gives a sense of, some of the arguments that are used for why Australia has to remain a fossil fuel provider and some of the alternatives that you see for Japan. Now, if anyone's interested in getting more thoughts here, as I say, we've got a packed schedule. We won't be having questions. Please do use the chat function, and then Yuki can respond to any thoughts that you have there. So you've given us a sense, Yuki, I think, of some of the things that are being asked of us by North Asia, by Japan, and by Korea. I'd now like to turn to think a bit about what's being asked of Australia from the Pacific. So delighted to invite Philly July Mara, who is the co-CEO of the Pacific Australia Youth Association and joining us from PNG. Hello, Philly. So Philly, your organisation obviously is dealing with youth and is dealing with connecting Australia's youth and Pacific youth. I'm interested in, how Australia's perceived in terms of policies and your sense of youth as agents of change. So please, over to you. Great. The slides are coming through perfectly. And if you can unmute, we should be able to hear you. Excellent. Thank you, Philly.
Thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. As mentioned by Melissa, my name is Philly July Mara, and I'm the current co-CEO of the Pacific Australia Youth Association. This is actually not my full-time job. It's my volunteer engagement in the region. So very happy to be here to speak more on the youth's perspective, especially the youth voices in climate policies with Australia. So a bit of the association in the region itself, PAYA for short, exists to foster deeper knowledge of the Pacific and Australia region by building meaningful relationships, connections, and communities. Our mission is to connect, empower, and equip young people across the Pacific and Australia region through leadership development, cultural exchange, and collaborative initiatives that build capacity, strengthen community, and inspire service-oriented action. So youth voices in climate policies. Climate change is a defining issue for our generation, especially for our Pacific nations and who are the front line of these impacts. And so the threat of climate change has led to growing focus on climate resilience, where young people are actively engaged in mostly community awareness campaigns, climate advocacy, local adaptation initiatives, environmental education, and climate policy engagement at regional level. In terms of Australia's climate policy youth perceptions is that from the perspective of many Pacific youths in the regions who takes pride of their nations and their resources, they mostly perceive the Australian's climate policies as a contradiction to its climate commitment and regional climate leadership. Pacific youths perceive Australia to engage more in co-create solutions that are grounded in our shared Pacific values and build transparent partnerships with community youths and communities on climate action. So how can young people be agent of change in these spaces? Basically, is to contribute to youth-led solutions on shared Pacific challenges, such as climate adaptations, governance, and development, which contributes to building lasting connections grounded in regional solidarity. Some of the engagements that the association does to support this ongoing engagement is we conduct in-person community workshops with youths who are in communities and have initiatives that benefits the community. And so we support those community workshops. We coordinate regional summits where we amplify the voices of young people. And we have our annual youth leadership summits that we do every year and bring participants from the Australia and the Pacific region together to connect, network, and learn from each other and appreciate one another's culture. We conduct webinars that brings people with wisdom to share knowledge to the younger generations, and have informal catch-up events, because as Pacific people, we enjoy storytelling. So the catch-up events is more bringing informal, bringing young people together to share stories, inspire one another. We also like to highlight the work of what young people are doing in the region. So a lot of stories are out on their resilience to climate change and other issues that they're trying to implement in their communities. Conduct project implementations that are solution-oriented to issues such as climate change, and of course have dialogues with important people at the regional level. So those are some of the engagements that as an association we do to support this. As a youth, our call to action in this space is that there is a growing interest of Pacific youth in regional policy making. So we have to amplify these voices of what is being raised by young people. Conduct inclusive dialogues in shaping climate resilience within the Australian Pacific region. Support for youth-led climate justice advocacy and community engagement. And finally is long-term investment into climate strategies that have worked in communities. So young people have invested their time to do strategies within their communities that is workable, and so working with them to minimize the issues that we have, especially in terms of climate change. So that's my small presentation, and I hope it's informative to each and every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, and we really love hearing the voice from the work you've been doing with young people in Australia and the Pacific, and that call to action that you're giving to all of us. So I will now move into the Canberra policy space, if I may, and a perfect person to start us off on that is Alan Bain, who's from the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs program. Alan's been a policymaker for a long time, and Alan, I particularly asked you to come because you've looked at some of the history of Australia's diplomacy and the way that it's often been used for fossil fuels, and you've tried to offer with Retd a different idea of what Australian diplomacy might look like if it's in the service of Australia as a renewable superpower. So can you tell us a bit about that vision?
Well, Melissa, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It won't surprise you and anybody who knows my work that I'm going to offer you a fairly unvarnished approach to Australian diplomacy. It's not often, I think, that one's asked to address a four-way oxymoron. So in these brief remarks, I'm going to make some comments on manage, tension, diplomacy, and fossil fuel, meaning hydrocarbons, of course, in all its forms. I'll start by saying that successive Australian governments have not been particularly good at managing anything much. Our critical problem, as it is with our confused use of words like strategy and strategic, is that we actually don't know what policy is. We just use the word. And the fact is, if you don't know what policy is, then you can't manage it. Now, policy, and I've done a lot of work on this over the last 50 years, policy is about three main things. It's recognising the inherent contradictions that make up wicked problems, resolving those contradictions, or at least being able to muddle a way through them, and then establishing the principles upon which consistent decisions will be made, and then sticking to those decisions. And on all of those tests, we don't come out very well. The component parts of renewables policy are particularly difficult, I think. And I'll just touch on a couple of them. I mean, everybody in this webinar knows what they are, but vested interests versus commercialising invention and innovation, caution versus initiative, timidity versus courage, follow the crowd versus moral leadership, insecurity versus confidence. The list is endless. So the default position becomes one of subservience to powerful economic interests and condescension towards the less advantaged. And if you don't believe me, I think that Philly can probably tell you quite a lot about Pacific attitudes to Australia and its high-handedness, particularly in climate. Now, tension, that's something that we actively avoid, essentially by denying it. Prime Minister Howard, for example, said that we don't have to choose between our history and our geography. Various other prime ministers have told us that we don't have to choose between Beijing and Washington. And any number of climate ministers have claimed that you can square the circle between exploiting natural resources such as gas and protecting the environment. We evidently can't. Just ask Australia's First Peoples and the nations of the Pacific. We blithely talk about adaptation and mitigation without admitting that the global carbon burden is actually increasing. The national political discourse is constructed around confected or constructed binaries, which we generally dismiss by interposing non sequiturs. So with, for example, history and geography, we'll say, no, of course you don't have to make that choice. The non sequitur then comes in because we will act in our own interest, which has got nothing to do with either of the two limbs of the binary. And this is the way our political discourse is conducted around climate all the time. So whether it's, our politicians are really good at this, so whether it's around nuclear disarmament or whether it's around global carbon reduction or managing future pandemics, we are hardwired to wait for catastrophe rather than to preempt it. I want to turn to diplomacy. Now, this is a word that we use in Australia to legitimise procrastination. Channeling Clausewitz, Zhou Enlai famously said that diplomacy is the continuation of war by other means. And if that were true, at least we'd have an engaged diplomacy. But as it stands, we prefer to spend $55 billion a year on defence and contemplate spending unbelievable amounts on peak predator submarines that we may never actually acquire, rather than build up our capacity for multilateral negotiation. And one of the people whom I most admire, Melissa Conley-Tyler, said this just a couple of years back, and I just think it's a lovely way of putting it. If the national budget were $100, we spend $7 on defence, 7 cents on development assistance, and copper coins on diplomacy. When is not enough still too much, Melissa? I suppose it's when you can find real copper coins. In fact, diplomacy is about creating international convergence between different or perhaps competing state interests. And crudely, Australia just wants to flog hydrocarbons. Our neighbours want the world to stop using hydrocarbons. But we're happy to offer spin and distortion rather than policy solutions because we're not up to them. Short-term returns for foreign investors trumps long-term returns for Australians and our neighbours in the Pacific. So to fossil fuels, well now that's a dirty word and we avoid it. We don't like to use fossil fuels. We talk about energy and energy needs. We talk about transition, make-believe such as carbon capture and storage, which Yuki dispatched beautifully to the boundary, I thought. We talk about global security and stability by supplying natural gas and metallurgical coal as a way of helping nations to avoid going to war over energy resources. It's a world of policy make-believe. And we don't give renewables a chance. The phony conversation about nuclear power going on in Australia for the last couple of years is just another symptom of our inability and unwillingness to address the danger of global warming. And we like to hide that too under another euphemism. We just like to call it climate change, which we've had forever, we're told. So to conclude, Australia evidently has enormous potential as a renewable superpower, but we don't have the ticker. We haven't got the heart and the courage. We profoundly lack the courage to employ the very considerable reserves of national power that we do have in the interests of both our own economic future and the future of our neighbours and the global community at large. We hide behind recalcitrants like President Trump, for whom the future is nothing more than transactional short-term steps. Without courage and leadership at the political level, Australia will continue to maintain its well-earned reputation for deferential irrelevance.
Thank you, Alan. And I think you've defined our wicked problems well. When you're talking about diplomacy and its role in an international convergence of interests, it makes me feel there's a real positive story in there if we can only get it right. So I'm also going to take the positive from your usual excoriating view of what we have done so far. So I'm now going to turn to, oh, and sorry, I should keep reminding people, please do put your responses, anything you'd like people to reply to in the chat. Our panelists are staying online, so if there's anything that you're wanting to interact with them on, don't lose the opportunity. Please do put it in chat now. So I'm now going to turn to our next panelist, to Neil Greet, who retired as a colonel from the Australian Army and is now an executive member of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. So Neil, I wanted to come to you to talk a little bit about, again, what the future holds for us in that sense. Your group talks very much about why Australia needs to make climate a security priority. And I'm interested if you could tell us a bit more about the security consequences if we fail to plan and adequately address climate change risks.
Yes, thank you very much, Melissa, for the invite. And to that point, if I just might open by saying what Alan has just said and following him, is there is hope, right? But hope is not necessarily blind optimism or blind pessimism, right? It's understanding the realities of the world and going forward. So the reality of security is framed in hope, not in a negative way. So thanks to the speakers before me, thanks to all those who are joining us, and best wishes to the authors with their papers, which we'll hear about soon. Now, I know, Melissa, you offered a welcome to country, an acknowledgement of country, but I'll just quickly, I'm on Ngunnawal land, and I also acknowledge the elders past and present, but I do it again because Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islanders, were part of the land, part of water and the skies. They understood that. They sought security from nature by creating collective wisdom and the way they lived. Now hold that thought, right? Because we're much more cleverer today, much more sophisticated, and we have these deep strategies, as Alan touched on, which explain why we do things. We have enemies, and those are those who wish to do us harm, and we give them faces, motives, names, and we have this long history of understanding that. And we bundle all those fears into national security, right? And national security can mean many things to many people. And it's often, as Alan alluded to, framed only in the idea of defence, defence being only one subset of national security. But you would think from the discourse in our community that it is equivalent to national security. And in fact, you would think that that's the real issue. It's war against enemies, and that is the most important threat. And it doesn't go into what actually we really have to be concerned about when we're considering national security. You know, for instance, the difficulty in the war against terror and then having to translate that into war against nation states. So where does that leave us with climate and security, which the Climate Security Leaders Group is actively trying to make a connection to, so that our leaders understand how to move on policy in the future. So climate is not an enemy. It has no face to hate. It merely becomes another enabler like defence industry or the economy or something that might be distant out there in the future. And that makes it a second order issue to most people in the discussion that we hear on national security. It was mentioned, let's talk about submarines. Let's talk about the first order issue. And this leads us to the fallacy that it means we can have our fight with real enemies, with real things, and we can do that first. And when the time is appropriate, we can actually address climate change and the effect that it will happen on the world and its security. So we give this national security issue an ordered project management approach that we can deal with either or, and that climate change can wait. But as we all know, time waits for no man, and climate change will not be waiting there for us to solve it at a time when we think appropriate. Thirdly, and if I want to introduce this particularly in relation to renewable energy, and that is the very real conflict going on now in the war of information and disinformation. Security is real. There's money in it, there's capabilities, there's history, vast array of history. People's jobs matter, and it's normally associated with a conservative style of thinking, and it links to fossil fuels. All those things are linked together by certain interests that are working out in the information domain. And if you put a gender framing on it, it's often hyper-masculinity, which is being promoted in some parts of the world to get messages or to change the way democracy works. But climate change is, of course, something of the domain of the do-gooder, greenies, protesters, those who are weak-minded and not prepared to fight. Right? It's framed that way so that there's a divide between climate change and security, and a framing between fossil fuels and then renewables. And it's genderized again in this discussion in disinformation as a feminine approach. So what you've got is this information war right now that is dividing us. So what I really want people to think about is the security leaders of Climate Group are about framing climate and security together so that we can understand the challenges of the future, not just of war, but those things that have been pointed out before of diplomacy, communities, renewable energy. And it brings me back to the starting point, which about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As the world heats and changes, we will fight each other in some shape or form, but we must be able to concurrently be seeking security from nature and its effects. And we don't understand how to do that concurrent piece. And that's what we're about, security and climate. And good luck to and I look forward to hearing the presenters on their papers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. And I think all four of our panelists have laid the scene beautifully. It is clear we are dealing with wicked problems, as Ellen talked about, for our security, for our diplomacy, for our relations with the Pacific, and for our relations with North Asia and Japan. And you've also talked about the potential for real political divisions, misinformation, and the things that make it very hard for Australia to deal with these issues. So given that, we hope we are not putting too many expectations on the shoulders of our wonderful paper presenters. Each of the papers, I think, has tackled different parts of these wicked problems. And as is usual for AP4D's work, focuses on what are some pathways to get us from where we are now to some of the places where we think we might want to be. So propositional and positive and future focused. So first I'm going to turn to the author of the first paper, James Bowen, who's from ReMap Research and a fellow at the Australia-India Institute. And his paper talks about how Australia can align its various security goals, whether they're climate security, energy security, economic and traditional security. So over to you, James, to give people a quick idea of what is in the paper.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thanks to all the other speakers. I think, yeah, I'm going to be trying and be ambitious and piece together everything basically that's being said thus far, and maybe set the scene as well for Liz and Oliver to speak on their report as well. I want to thank also WWF Australia, which actually supported the production of this report that I'm discussing today. So yeah, we talked a bit about divided interests and divided commitments and various interactions between various concerns, but my report, I think, is kind of about how we avoid or minimize trade-offs to the best extent possible in Australia, and also our region's domestic and our foreign policies in the face of climate change and the energy transition. And it particularly relates to that concept of security and what is a basic concern within security for minimizing threats. So everything in the report essentially starts from the position that over the longest time horizon, climate change will remain the biggest security threat for states and societies, also the physical systems that sustain them. But for a long time, I think the dominant perception has been in Australia and elsewhere that responding to climate change does involve unavoidable trade-offs, particularly in the economic sphere. I don't think that ever made sense when you account for the very real and sizable costs of climate change in terms of economic natural disasters, global warming more broadly. But I think nevertheless what we saw in the Albanese government's first election campaign and part of its initial time in power was an increasing perception that there were no longer those obvious trade-offs between climate and economy. And that was represented in this emerging vision of Australia as a renewable superpower, which would quite likely thrive in the net zero or ideally real zero emissions world. And I believe that vision also allowed Australia to start to see past the notion of needing to make trade-offs between domestic and foreign policy, because Australia always saw, or a lot of Australians always saw, climate inaction as mostly a net loss on that front, on the international front as well, particularly in relations with the Pacific. But based on those initial conclusions around the first part of the Albanese government, I think a lot of us were caught off guard a bit when not long into that first term, we were presented with this new trade-off, essentially, between acting on climate or providing for the energy security of our trading partners. So there was a claim that basically Australian interventions that might impact on long-term provision of fossil fuels would necessarily degrade the energy security of countries like Japan and Korea. And that case was made quite explicitly by officials and industry members and other stakeholders from those countries. And it was repeated by sympathetic Australian equivalents, essentially. And so that was essentially a new strategic international argument for Australia going slow on climate. And it had a lot of apparent resonance in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war and the surrounding geopolitical and geo-economic contestation that was present at the time. I think that always seemed a bit convenient as well from the perspective of those who favour climate inaction, that we've having seemingly avoided certain old trade-offs. We faced a supposedly new trade-off about optimising international strategy as it related to Asia. But most of the, from my perspective, a lot of the surrounding debate seemed to take these new energy security arguments at face value. And this report sought to give them more proper investigation and to locate them in that broader conception of security and relationship between various concerns. So I was quite confused by how that debate around energy security seemed to suggest that countries like Japan and Korea, who were almost totally dependent on imported fossil fuels that were traded in increasingly volatile markets, could somehow best achieve energy security by doubling down on that dynamic. I think the debate also suggested that somehow Australia was the key to unlocking this energy security. I think we solely the key to unlocking it. We are a trusted country for our trading partners, but we're also a high-cost country, and we don't have the power to magically transport energy safely through hostile waters or to help countries insulate against exposure to heavily regionalized and often globalized energy markets. So I don't think that those arguments held up. But the most surprising thing of all, I think, in that debate that happened around energy security was that energy security was essentially presented as a more clear and present danger than climate change and climate security. I think energy security is a valid strategic concern for states, but it's also a concept it's open to really significant interpretation and application, whereas climate change is clearly a more severe and longer-term challenge, and our understanding of it is also grounded in a very deep scientific consensus. And so the report better locates energy security in relation to that logically more dominant concern of climate security. And it also considers the relationship of these securities to traditional military security and also economic security. And that economic security concept has been around for a while, but it had a bit of a renaissance in the wake of COVID and Russia, Ukraine, and global trade wars. And I think it also relates to the energy transition, which is a source of considerable disruption of power balances and interdependencies. So in the report, I make a quite strong claim for that notion of economic security rather than energy security as actually being a more useful lens through which we can think about why interest in Asia and some supportive interest in Australia are now opposing action on climate change. It's precisely, I think, because it's become more easy to see how many actors and indeed many states might economically benefit from the net zero or real zero transition, rather than all of us becoming poorer, as seemed to be the previous argument. And I think there's a good example of where energy security has been quite deliberately presented as cover for what I would consider economic security concerns in what Yuki, in the case Yuki, touched on around Japanese interests, reselling significant volumes of Australian LNG to elsewhere in Asia, not using it for themselves despite claiming that it was for their own energy security reasons. And that's helping to build new fossil fuel markets. And I think there's a calculation on Japan's part, and it's similar in other countries, that their economic future lies in these fossil fuels because of challenges adopting to renewables and clean energy-led development. And part of that perception is rooted in geophysical reality, but I think a lot has to do with political and policy interactions, including the extent to which China has already obtained dominance in genuine clean energy supply chains and seemingly crowded out others. But the report, I think, finds there's no real need for this zero-sum view of there being distinct energy transition winners and losers, or to believe that new security complications that are tied to net zero, like China's dominance, will be as severe as those that have been related to fossil fuels. So starting from that perspective that climate security is the most empirically grounded conception of security, and working down from there, I find that there's no inherent trade-offs with energy security, with economic security or traditional military security at an aggregate level or individual country level. And most of those securities can indeed be enhanced in a net zero world pending the right policy commitments and perhaps more importantly, the right philosophical orientation. And that's that concept. This is what I refer to as green security, essentially, or comprehensive green security. So Australia indeed is quite a lucky country again in this context, given we have a clear vision of how we can transition from one mode of economic and strategic development to another. Australia indeed could become richer at the same time as providing new forms of security, so including energy security by helping to diversify and increase resilience in critical minerals and other key clean technology supply chains that are currently dominated by China and others. But I think one of the most significant challenges we face is that many of the countries who do find it really difficult to see a similar vision, to set a similar vision, are important partners in existing fossil fuel sectors, and we now know they won't easily transition to an alternative vision themselves, and they won't adequately align with our change vision as well in that context. So in the context of Japan and Korea as well, who have been most dominant in this debate, fossil fuel partners are also tightly aligned in a more geopolitical, geostrategic sense as well, creating additional challenges around transition. But I note in the report how a central claim of this renewable superpower vision that Australia has, that we might onshore significant energy intensive activity in things like green iron or other metals production, comes at the acknowledged cost of countries like Japan and Korea, who will have to offshore that activity. But those aren't really avoidable disruptions if we're going to meet our climate goals at a global level. And I think there are some trades to consider here, but not necessarily trade-offs, I would argue. So Japan and Korea would often be able to retain more labor-intensive activities like final steel making, but not necessarily iron making, and they could diversify their economies into other valuable areas. And they would, in essence, be offshoring their intense energy security concerns that they highlight to Australia. So Australia will be taking on board those under this renewable superpower vision. So that's that's some of the logic of what I call green security, and I think that government accepting this logic is half the battle won, because, as I said, the blockage on climate action previously has been around a failure to see a vision forward. We've had an idea of how economically we can adapt, but perhaps we need to think around how we adapt in a broader security sense, our mindset, and then we have to use that change in philosophy to inform policy making and concrete policy making. So I think Australia has a quite huge opportunity to operationalise some commitments to this greener security by developing a new national security strategy, which we don't currently have, that can recognise, well, not a current one anyway, that can recognise the importance of climate and various other security concerns. And we essentially committed to do that under the 2018 Bowen Declaration with the Pacific Islands Forum. We could also increase the understanding of the nature and interactions of various securities in other ways, including by releasing the Office of National Intelligence's 2023 Climate Security Assessment. And we can also provide additional support to our own and our region's transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy and clean energy. So we can act more in line with the Clean Energy Transition Partnership that we signed up to at COP28 climate meeting. And that committed us to phasing out fossil fuel finance and phasing in more clean energy finance, which I think Australia has started to do in areas like Southeast Asia. But signing up to that CETP also compelled Australia to convince other countries to follow suit and end fossil fuel finance and scale up clean energy finance. So Japan and Korea would be good targets of our leveraging that membership of the CETP and then seeking to expand its membership. And I think Australia should at least draw a clearer line on not supporting fossil fuel sustaining commitments regionally or domestically. So regionally, Japan's Asia Zero Emissions Community, despite the name, is actually undermining some of the green financing commitments that Australia is making in regions like Southeast Asia by sustaining fossil fuel dependence. And I think it's clear we will need much more managed economic and strategic relationships in general, because current market-based and geopolitical interactions are not actually getting the job done. So this will necessarily include much more climate-conscious diplomatic partnerships with key partners, once again led by Japan and Korea. And I think we need to more actively prosecute the case for our renewable superpower vision in those relationships. But at the same time, we should be aiming to ensure that other countries can find their equivalent places in a Paris Agreement aligned world. And we also will need entirely new trade and investment architecture. And I think this leads into the conversation that Liz and Oliver will take up on Clean Commodities Trading Company. I think it's an excellent proposal for how we would actually start to shift the global economy and our regional trading relationships in the direction that we want to see them. We'll also need sustained domestic commitment to our green industries. And I think we also need bigger sticks, principally stronger carbon pricing on fossil fuel development, as well as the carrots we're offering through things like the Future Made in Australia plan, because the history of just green development mode or green growth only is not great in terms of the emissions reduction potential that this delivers. So we would also need to better internationally signpost our long-term transition into this renewable superpower and a provider of renewable-based energy security rather than fossil fuel-based energy security. So I think it's reasonable for us to provide some assurances of us being able to provide some short-term transitional fossil fuel-based security to our Asian trading partners, but with a clear long-term phase-out plan that aligns with the Paris Agreement. And we can have an accompanying phase-in pathway for green industries, including by setting key targets for green goods and renewable energy, and goods based on that and trade based on that, essentially. And I think also, quite importantly, we need to work with the Pacific more closely in making the case for why this idea of green security makes sense and how it might be achieved. So hosting or holding more joint dialogues between Australia, Pacific Island countries and Asian countries to advance this green security concept, and also using the COP31 process, if successful, our joint bidding with the Pacific for hosting the UN Climate Conference to really drive home this message and some of the attendant commitments that I've outlined today. So thanks, and look forward to the ensuing conversation.
I feel the same, and please do keep your questions and comments coming in, everyone. It's great to see one in from Virgilio Barbo from Timor-Leste. Good to see you here, and please, others keep coming in. James, I think you've given us a real suite of different options and pathways that we can be looking at. And that sets us up beautifully, as you say, for our next speakers. So I'm now going to call on Oliver Yates. Oliver was the former Chief Executive of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and now Head of Climate Technology and Energy Transition at Gore Capital. So Oliver, can you take us through the ideas in the paper around the case for a clean commodities trading initiative? Thank you.
Yes, good morning and thanks, Melissa. And thank you all for providing me the opportunity to brief you on the Clean Commodity Trading Initiative and what it is. And I hope you can take the time to review our paper. Now, look, at its core, the Clean Commodity Trading Initiative is designed to turn the dream of becoming this leading global producer of clean commodities into a reality. It's about accelerating the construction of clean commodity production projects in a way that's targeted, it's efficient, it's strategic. And so to use the word that Alan was mentioning, we can have the ticker that Alan mentioned, but without the risk of a heart attack. Quite simply, the CCTI exists to solve the biggest barrier that's preventing clean commodity production facilities from entering into construction right now. And that's the lack of bankable demand at a price which allows construction to even start. Right now, Australia has the minerals, we have the technology, we have the capital to become a leader, but projects like green iron, green ammonia, sustainable aviation fuel, and many others are stalled. And that's not because Australia lacks the ability to be this world-leading producer, but because the market will not pay the premium necessary for clean products over dirty products. And I can tell you no one will build a $2 billion green iron plant and then the $20 billion of renewable and hydrogen facilities that plant will need without clear visibility of a contract from a credit-worthy counterparty that guarantees that project can sell its product at a predictable price higher than its cost of production. That's just the reality. Currently, unfortunately, we lack the regulatory rules which trigger that demand. See, currently commodity buyers are not compelled to buy an increasing proportion of low-emission commodities. Governments set these rules, and governments simply haven't put in place these necessary regulations. So this is the core problem that the CCTI solves. It allows governments to step in now, take that regulatory risk on themselves so that projects can move into construction. It's not difficult. Like shock horror, we're asking the government to take the risk on its own future actions. So the CCTI is simple. It just involves the government signing long-term offtake contracts, accepting the risk for its own future policy actions. This policy involves signing bespoke offtake contracts with projects that are ready to proceed right now. Those contracts would be tailored to their specific costs and timelines to guarantee the purchase of those clean commodities when they're produced for those selected projects so that we can get them underway now. This doesn't involve taking the risk that the facility can produce the commodities, just that if they do, they'll receive an agreed price. And why would you do that? Well, only the government can do that because the largest portion of price risk in these commodities is actually the regulatory price risk. And that price risk is 100% in the government's control. So this isn't about subsidies. This is about allocating risk to the party that can best manage it. See, clean commodities actually come in two parts, and that's where I think people get a little confused. You've got the product, and then effectively you've got the green premium. So the commodity itself, say iron or ammonia, could just be sold on the open market as a traditional product once produced. But the clean attribute, essentially the avoided emissions, could be separated and held or banked by the government as a credit. These clean commodity credits could be sold, might be able to be sold into current compliance markets like the European CBAM, but more likely they should be banked and then sold into new regulatory markets that we all know are coming, which will mandate an increasing proportion of these commodities to be clean. That scheme, again, is totally within the government's control, and the level of ambition the government sets will drive the price. Yep, all you're asking is the government to take risk on the value of a credit today when it retains the control over that credit's value in the future. This is making a fiscally responsible way to de-risk investments in projects today. By contracting now and banking the credits, the government is just getting ahead of the regulatory system it controls to ensure that Australia leads rather than lags on these opportunities. Importantly, the policy tool is actually transitional. It's a transitional solution. Its job is to get these early stage projects off the ground now so that by the time regulated markets emerge in 5 to 7 years, Australia already has the capacity, the skills and the trading relations in place so we can make the market work for us so that we can be ahead. Then as obviously the regulatory schemes scale and more private buyers emerge, the CCTI or the government would naturally unload its credits into the market that it's banked and actually withdraw from the market. This avoids the pitfalls of open-ended support. It creates a clear pathway to end that support, and that support in which when it ends, they can potentially fully recover any of the early support that they've provided to these early projects because they will be able to sell them into regulatory markets. So the CCTI isn't just clever economics, it's also clever statescraft, and Liz is going to talk more about that shortly. So what we're talking about is we start construction now on a selected number of projects that will trip off the construction of these significant mega renewable energy projects and hydrogen projects that are needed as inputs into these. The government shows then by doing that it actually can deliver this future made in Australia, as any of these contracts will trigger the knock-on investment and action that I've mentioned to before. It'll unlock a bucket load of private investment across the project's ecosystem without significant government outlays. Creates the regional jobs we've all been talking about across the supply chain, and it'll start to strengthen our alliances, particularly if we can get Japan and Korea involved in this. It'll help us and help them secure clean inputs for steel, shipping, for aviation, everything we need to be doing in the Asian region. It prepares Australia for a world in which these green trade rules are standard, in which targets are standard, which markets exist. And they'll all be critical if we're not going to flinch on our climate targets. I think we all believe they're necessary. So it is crucial. The CCT policy is a sensible policy. It's budget smart because the support is targeted. The contracts are customised. It's not across the board. It doesn't create a Me Too situation that the government's facing, say, with the production tax credits. The public funding that is given to these early projects by banking those credits can be recovered over the time as the market matures. It's one of the few policies around where you can provide the support now and actually you can sell those credits later and you can retain that and bring that back to the taxpayer. So I see it, and this is what we're going to talk about, the CCTI policy is effectively a precision tool designed to move a selected number of projects into construction by offering them tailor-made offtake contracts. It underwrites the price those products can be produced by selected early projects, triggering a wave of investment across the supply chain. This is billions. I mean, people think about, you know, oh, it's a steel mill, oh, that's 2 billion. But actually you're kicking off all of the renewables and all the hydrogen that needs to be built for that. These are massive projects in total. It gives us Australia a real shot at becoming a clean energy superpower that we all continue to crow at. And we does it in this fiscally and sensible and responsible way. So eventually we can move from promise and puff to construction and production in a highly responsible way. So again, I encourage you to read the paper, and if you support the logic, I suggest that maybe you may want to back it in, and hopefully we can get some of these projects underway and into construction. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Oliver. And I will go straight to Liz to continue on with what came out of the paper. So Elizabeth Thurbon is Professor of International Political Economy and Director of the Green Energy Statecraft Project at UNSW Sydney and the co-author of the paper. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Oliver, and thanks everyone for being here. It's great to be with you. So my job today really is to put the Clean Commodity Trading Initiative into broader geostrategic context and to explain why it really is the essential policy instrument for our time. So I'm just going to do three things very quickly. First of all, I'm going to identify the most important geostrategic development of the 21st century and three related mega trends that are now posing huge risks and opportunities for Australia. And then I'm going to explain why a government-owned clean commodities trading initiative of the kind that Oliver and I have written about in the paper must be a part of that strategic response. And then the third thing I'm going to do is show how these recent global shocks, especially those triggered by the Trump administration, only amplify the need for a clean commodities trading initiative. And my key message is this, that given the massive risks and opportunities that now face Australia, a clean commodities trading initiative isn't just a good policy idea, it's actually a strategic imperative. It's key to our national security. So first of all, let's start with defining the defining development of the 21st century, which really is China's remarkable rise and its embrace of a new model of national development and a new model of national security. So more than a decade ago, while other countries debated putting a price on carbon or modestly subsidizing green industries, China began building the world's largest renewable energy system, which is now completely unmatched in scale. And why was China doing this? Well, it wasn't to address climate change. It was to boost national security across 5 key dimensions. By building out the green energy transition, China knew it could boost energy security by reducing reliance on fossil fuel imports. It could boost economic security by creating new high-tech export-oriented industries in renewable industries. It could boost environmental security by cutting particulate pollution and addressing climate change. It could boost social security by creating skilled jobs, especially in the regions. And it could boost geostrategic or conventional security by enhancing its international status and prestige and building new alliances, particularly across the developing world. So for China's leaders, speeding up the energy transition was this massive national security multiplier, and it gave China first mover advantage in that. But that opportunity to use the energy transition as a national security multiplier still exists for any country smart enough to act, including Australia. But China's rapid shift has undermined, it's destabilized things for Australia, and in particular, it's undermined the viability, the long-term viability of our old economic model, our existing economic model, which is, of course, built around these carbon-intensive resource exports to East Asia. And it's also unleashed 3 mega trends with huge implications now for our security and prosperity. So the first mega trend is this plummeting cost of renewables. China's huge scale in building out renewables has really driven down costs, making renewables now the world's cheapest form of energy. And this has really disrupted the fossil fuel-centered global energy order. And investment momentum has now, we talk a lot, and we've spoken a lot about investments in fossil fuels, but the international investment momentum is actually now behind clean energy, which now attracts about 2/3 of all global energy investment. That's really important to understand. The second megatrend that China's transformation kicked off is this global wave now of green industrial policy, especially in Asia. Governments across Europe and emerging economies are investing big in green energy, but it's Northeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan that are leading the way. And for over a decade, Korea and Japan, two of our energy partners, have pursued green ambitions alongside their fossil-fueled ones, ambitious green ambitions in hydrogen and other green industries. And as with China, their motive isn't just climate, it isn't even principally climate, it's national security. It's about reducing fossil fuel reliance and building future industries. And the third megatrend that China's transformation kicked off is this intensifying US-China rivalry. The US, of course, woke up quite late to China's rise. It's now racing to recapture leadership in strategic high-tech advanced manufacturing. Under Biden, of course, this was more obvious. Renewables became the front line in this techno-economic battle, and the Inflation Reduction Act was the signature policy. But while aimed at China, the IRA also legitimised globally a stronger role for governments in the green transition, something that Western countries and something that Australia had long resisted. And it finally prompted a meaningful response from the Australian government in the shape of Future Made in Australia. And I think that really signals that Canberra now very much recognises the threats to our conventional dig and ship economic model and the massive upsides of moving up the value chain. Iron ore was mentioned briefly across the panel, just one example. This is our top export earner, brings in about 138 billion a year, 1/3 of all our resource exports. Modelling, of course, shows that as our Northeast Asian partners decarbonise their steelmaking, these revenues could more than halve. That's a huge economic security threat for Australia. But again, to use a conventional phrase, Australia is being kicked in the ass with a rainbow, because as organisations like Climate Energy Finance and the Superpower Institute have shown, if we actually use our renewable energy capabilities to manufacture green iron and export that instead, we can actually triple the value of our largest export industry. And this opportunity isn't just economic, it's geostrategic. So green iron offers this way to deepen our partnerships with Japan and Korea, helping our neighbours to decarbonise steel, their major export industry, and retain their global competitiveness. And of course, steel alone accounts for about 6.7% of global emissions. So with Europe's CBAM looming, Asia's steel makers really do need our clean inputs, and they need them fast. And Australia really has the opportunity here to be this partner of choice in economic security and in decarbonisation. But the crucial question is, of course, what policy instrument is going to allow Australia to get us there? So to succeed, we need to move fast. We need to mobilise capital at scale. We need to spur innovation, but we need to do all of this in a very, very budget-constrained environment. We are not the USA. We are not China. We cannot afford trillion-dollar subsidies, which is why we need highly targeted, highly efficient and effective instruments, ones that deliver obvious value for taxpayers and multipliers against multiple domains. And on all accounts, the Clean Commodities Trading Initiative ticks this box. As Oliver explains, the initiative would de-risk private investment by issuing those purchase contracts. It would incentivise innovation, crucial to productivity, by guaranteeing prices. It would multiply investment and productivity down the whole supply chain, and it would align with the government's goals for strategic partnerships, building strategic partnerships with our regional allies. And if it was trilaterally owned with Japan and Korea, which would be a great outcome, it could even catalyse joint decarbonisation, unlock new export markets, and send a very powerful message of regional cooperation. So finally, with the last minute, let's just briefly address the Trump issue. Obviously, Trump's past actions, withdrawing from Paris, repealing the IRA, starting the trade wars, have created major disruptions. And his current trajectory today, just a new round of tariffs, also adds uncertainty. But it doesn't reverse the mega trends I was discussing at the start. China's green development model isn't changing. Renewables will continue to remain the cheapest form of energy. Climate change is still demanding action. That won't change. Global investment will keep shifting towards clean energy because the cost logic has now shifted. Korea and Japan are increasingly in on decarbonisation because they understand this is crucial to their national security comprehensively conceived: economic, energy, social, geostrategic and environmental. And Australia's fossil fuel-based model, therefore, will remain under threat until we fix it. And in fact, Trump may even amplify the opportunities that we have, because his attacks on the IRA are certainly now driving capital and talent out of the US, seeking new investment destinations. And our new majority government and our future made in Australia agenda are sending that clear signal that investors have long waited for from Australia. We now have this credibility, this committed signal to attract that capital, which has been really lacking in the past. And Trump's hostility towards his allies only really heightens this importance now of deeper Australia-Asia partnerships. So for all of these reasons, I think it's fair to say the Clean Commodities Trading Initiative isn't just a nice to have, it's a must have. It's the right response at the right time to secure our economic future and to secure our national security in a very rapidly changing world. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you to all three of our paper authors for giving such a clear sense of what the argument is. Now, I am waiting for more questions to come in, so please, there are many of you still here watching. Please put your questions in the question and answer, and we will come to them. What I'll do while I'm waiting for a few more to come in is I'll go back to our panel to get a sense of their reaction to what they've heard. So Neil, I might start with you. I think we've heard from James, from Oliver, from Liz, this connection between acting on climate and ensuring and capturing our future security is a very strong one, and it's certainly not climate and security in opposition. What was your reaction to the themes around climate and security and what you've heard?
Well, Melissa, thank you very much. I enjoyed all those three presentations, and it really made me think. And to be honest, it feels good to be amongst a group of people who are thinking about this. Of course, the next step is, who do we get to champion this and how do we progress? I did shoot a question to James about national security strategy and the fact that we don't have this deeper concept of where we want to go. And I really loved Elizabeth's talk about China. I just want us to be honest about China in this country. And I've tried to say something to the same of you, Elizabeth, and I've been shot down and a bit embarrassed because I'm seen as being, a pro, whatever they call it, China person, and I don't understand how nasty and the real world problems, which comes back to my way we're framed in this issue, but people don't understand how China has taken this direction, why they've done it, and the intelligence that lies behind it. I really enjoyed all three, the dimensions, and I did put my engineer hat on for Oliver. I find a deeper problem is we don't have enough engineers, right? And he said we can get them from India, but as the world moves on, we're not going to have enough, and our education system is not producing enough STEM-related people. So once I pick the onion layer, I find a few more things that we need to get right. But thank you to the three of you. It was great.
Thank you. And over to you, Ellen, reactions.
Melissa, thank you very much. Look, I'd have to say they're three fabulous papers, very heartening because they provide the evidence that you always need if you're going to undertake a metamorphosis of policy. If you don't have evidence underpinning your policy, then you don't have policy either. You create it on fictions, which is more or less what I was attacking in my opening comments. I think we've got a lot to be, pretty depressed about at the moment as we look around, and it's not just Donald Trump. He's sort of, in some respects, emblematic of it. But we look across the world in which we live, and we see the enormous suffering of Palestinians, the insecurity of Israelis, the deep insecurity of people of Iran. We look at the uncertainties around Eastern Europe at the moment, look at the horrors of Africa. There's a lot to be pretty pessimistic about. And I think the beautiful thing about the three papers, I shouldn't have said beautiful, should I? The wonderful thing about the three papers that we've had today is that there is actually much for us to be hopeful about if we can get ourselves into some kind of condition whereby we replace confidence and courage with the sort of craven concession that we like to conduct our diplomacy with so often. AP4D does wonderful things on the nature of statecraft and the need for diplomacy, but a bit like the work that we're doing at the Australia Institute, Melissa, we're not getting nearly enough traction. We look at a very pusillanimous approach to almost everything that the government is touching at the moment. And I don't want to put the boot into Albanese or Penny, for whom I once worked. It's really the default position in which we as Australians conduct so much of our domestic and international policy. And so coming back to Neil's point just then on STEM and the need for engineers, I mean, it's a crying demand. And even in the AUKUS game, everybody's screaming and shouting about how we cannot do it without the engineers that we need just for fabrication. And I'm not talking about sort of people with PhDs in nautical engineering. I'm talking about people who can actually do the engineering work. So in all of this, I think these papers are important contributions, but we have to push them and ourselves, I'm afraid, just a little bit harder to get a bit more traction in government itself, so that ministers like Chalmers and Bowen, ministers like Wong, and of course the Prime Minister, have got much more courage in pushing for Australia's interests rather than simply accommodating to the interests of the United States and other major players. I hope Albo does well in China this week.
Okay. Do you, Philly, with any reactions?
Thanks, Melissa. By hearing all the speakers that spoke was very informative for me as a young individual in working in the space of youth across the region, specifically when it comes to policy. Like, the policy that is done comes with strategy, and that's like the way forward in terms of helping our people in the region. It's very important that young people have access to such information as this, especially with their Pacific youths, that they have limited information into this of what Australia is trying to do in the region. And so such information is very important to be disseminated to young people. But overall, the work of FIRE we do is to connect our like-minded individuals, young people who are doing different work in the different spaces, because we believe that we're the future for our region one day. And so investing in different spaces across the region is giving us more hope about making the right leadership, having that right leadership when we one day find ourselves in policy making and government and all that. So thank you very much for a very insightful presentation.
Thank you. Okay, and Yuki, any reaction?
Yeah, thank you for the three presentations. It reminds me huge potential, especially for Japan and Australia cooperation. And yeah, so in my presentation, I can only discuss about the power utility sector, but the huge potential for other sector, iron sector, and other material sectors. So that's good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we had some more questions come in from Lawrence Phillips, asking about the opportunities for Australia to cooperate with Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN in its energy transition. So I'm going to go to James and then Oliver for that. And then Liz, I think I'll finish up with you with the last question.
Thank you. So I think Australia actually has already done some interesting things with kind of green economy and climate finance partnerships with Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN as a whole. It's actually probably the area where our commitments are most notable after, as I mentioned, this clean energy transition partnership that Australia signed up to. We have actually notably transitioned to providing a lot more clean energy supply chain and climate finance support to the region. I think the challenge is that there's alternative external pressure, as I mentioned, from groups like Japan's Asia Zero Emissions Community, which is providing a lot of fossil fuel finance, sustained fossil fuel finance. It's claimed to be a climate commitment, but analysis has found that most of its financing is actually going towards gas and abated coal and other technologies that aren't actually climate friendly. So there's a need to actually compete again, I guess, a bit more about those and actually work with Japan and work with others to actually get broader commitments around who provides that finance and who provides that support to the region, because Southeast Asia, I think, is one of the most contested geographic locations in the world around where the transition is going. After Northeast Asian growth, after South Asian growth, Southeast Asia is, an emerging powerhouse in terms of economic development and energy consumption, has a lot of fossil fuels, has a lot of fossil fuel dependencies, needs to transition, is incredibly dependent on external support. So just more consistent resourcing, long-term resourcing to those partnerships that exist, and taking on some of those other unhelpful commitments in the region, I think, useful as well.
Straight to you, Oliver.
Look, I mean, I think the opportunity to work together with our key local or friendly trading partners is only becoming more intense, particularly with the US isolating itself. But, when I think people forget when you look at these type of projects, and that was the reason why I was making a little bit of emphasis, is that there is so much for Asian countries to benefit from these projects. Australia really has the renewable energy resource, in other words, the wind and the sun and the minerals, right? It doesn't really have even the people to build these projects, but it won't be providing the panels necessarily, the wind turbines, the electrolyzers. All of that type of equipment is still going to likely be sourced from our trading partners. So if I was Japan or Korea and I was saying, wow, shouldn't I join in this initiative to risk share on these early projects by signing offtake contracts on the basis that we've just spoken about, how we can actually get the money back that we kind of provide to them today by making sure the regulatory system's in place to take those credits, I think they'd be bonkers not to, because frankly, everybody wants to be, and these countries, particularly Korea and Japan, are manufacturers of that equipment. They would love to see that equipment in operation, and Australia is an ideal place in which those facilities could be built. So I think there's a lot to be gathered, not only for Australia to be benefiting out of this, but there's a hell of a lot for our trading partners to benefit out of this as well.
Now, Liz, I'm going to go to you with our last question from Dermot O'Gorman from WWF, who has been working on, issues around Australia as a renewable energy superpower and has been very, very influential on this. He says that he often hears an assumption that our international trading partners and global industries will welcome Australia being a renewable energy superpower, but in reality, they're not. And so he's interested in the sort of mindset skills on how to be a diplomatic green superpower globally. Over to you, Liz, on mindset.
Dermot, that's a great question, and I should say thank you for all the excellent work that you do as well. If I could start answering that question by just briefly coming back to China's role in this, and I think as Neil mentioned, it is frustrating the way in which we often think about China's role in the transition and in Australia's relationships more generally. We do tend to take a very hyper-securitized vision of China, but we often forget some really crucial lessons that are coming out of that country, and one or crucial aspects of that country's story that are really relevant for us. And one is that, you know, one of the things that the Chinese government is trying to do at the moment is actually to develop. It is still trying to, you know, integrate hundreds of millions of people into an economy and to lift living standards of hundreds of millions of people. And it's trying to do that in a way that is completely different that countries have in the past. It's to a great degree, it's trying to, from this point, bypass the fossil fueled model of development and to build a new development model centred on renewable energies. And it's really important for Australia to understand, given that what happens in China will very much shape what happens regionally and across the globe, is that now all of China's additional energy demand is very likely to be met entirely by renewables. China is building new coal-fired power stations, but it's not switching them on. It's building them as backup in case, but it's not switching them on. It's meeting its new energy demand from renewables. It looks like China has peaked emissions and peaked them early, years earlier than anticipated. So the momentum coming out of that region is very big. And this has really important implications of how we engage as a good development partner, Australia, across the region. It won't do for Australia to keep promoting and helping support a fossil-fueled model of industrialisation, you know, in our region, when there is an alternative being offered and being very visible in China as well. So it is, you know, the trajectory is clear, and the responsibility and the opportunity for Australia is very clear as well. The onus is on Australia to help shift, of course, this mindset too, with our traditional trading partners who are very heavily invested, of course, as we all have been, in the fossil fueled industries of the past, to help build an understanding of the huge economic and broader security potentials that exist there if we're smart enough to grasp them. So we have to get our story in Australia straight. You know, I think it's very easy to forget too how far we've come in Australia. It was only a couple of years ago that we weren't taken seriously because we had a government that wasn't committed to the energy transition. That has changed. That's an enormous positive. And the people I speak to in Canberra, it's fantastic to hear the awareness of and the excitement about the opportunities. But it's about creating the shared understanding and getting our story positive and consistent, as Alan said, a kind of consistent story and way of communicating this incredible potential that we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if I can go back to something else Alan said about how do we get this metamorphosis of policy, I feel it's somewhere between, you know, evidence, passion, and positive ideas, and that's what I've heard so very much today. So I want to deeply thank James, Liz, and Oliver for the papers, and Alan, Yuki, Philly, and Neil for their very thoughtful comments today. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us. We're always delighted with the number of people who come to these events. For your reference, we have some very interesting ones coming up. One at the end of the month that we'll be advertising soon. So if you're not already following us on social media, or if you haven't gone to our website and clicked on to get our monthly newsletter, please do, because we'd love to see you here again soon. So with huge thanks to all of our speakers, and particularly to the AP4D staff who make all of this look much easier than it actually is. Thank you all again.